So an interesting question that plagued the religious first century Galilean was, do I tithe on the food I bought in the marketplace? And here's the problem. Whether you tithed on it was determined by how it was used. So you tithed on all the produce grown in the land of Israel. So if the grain in the marketplace came from outside of Israel, you didn't have to tithe on it. If the grain was going to be used for, say, cattle feed or seed, you didn't have to tithe on it. You only tithed on what was for human consumption. So the farmer who's got excess crops, goes to the market and thinks to himself, do I need to tithe on this before I sell it? And he thinks, well, I don't know how they're going to use it. Maybe it will go for seed. So, and then he's motivated to not tithe on it because his profit will go down by 10% if he does. So he decides not to tithe on it. The merchant has the same dilemma. And he thinks to himself, I don't know whether people are going to tithe on this or how they're going to use it. So I don't need to tithe on it either. And it all comes down to the end user. And the end user had no way of knowing if the grower or the merchant had tithed. So the end user says to himself, well, I don't know if I need to tithe on this either. It might have already been tithed on. So the rabbis made a ruling that if you got food, like if you went to dinner at someone's house and they put food before you and you didn't know if it got tithed, you removed a portion of it for the priests because there's 1.5% that was due to them. And as long as you did that, then you were okay. So that's the kind of moral dilemmas you had in the first century. And a lot of scholars think that not much tithing went on, at least of anything that was sold in the market. In fact, the Pharisees had their own separate markets where they only sold stuff that was pre-tithed. And of course, nobody else bought there because it was 10% more expensive. But a lot of things didn't get tithed on. It's also interesting that you tithe on the produce that was grown in the land. So anything grown outside of Israel was exempt from tithes. Anything that wasn't produce was also exempt for tithes. So, for instance, Peter never had to tithe on his catch because it wasn't produce grown in the land of Israel, it was fish. So he didn't tithe. To get even wilder, if you were in that time, you couldn't support Jesus' ministry out of his tithes, or out of your tithes, because Jesus is not a Levite. So the way we think about tithes today is quite different than how they thought about them in the first century. We want to tithe on everything, our gross income, and yet they were tithing on what they consumed. Now, since they're poor subsistence farmers, they're consuming a fairly good percentage of what they make, but still, it's a different way to look at tithing.